Welcome to the College of Education 10-Minute Research Break, a podcast devoted to highlighting research by Illinois State University's College of Education, faculty, staff, and students. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and take a break with us.
Hi, I'm Tricia Klass. Today I'm talking with Dr. Brian Horn, who's a faculty member in the School of Teaching and Learning. The article we will discuss today focuses on his experience with student-formed groups when he was a middle school language arts teacher. Welcome, Brian. Thank you for talking with me.
Thank you very much for having me.
First, could you discuss the research literature related to best practice in grouping students?
Sure. I think most of the research that practicing teachers today come in contact with is try to frame grouping students in a very structured way, trying to get away from ability groups that were more the norm decades ago. Heterogeneous grouping is more the norm today, wanting students to interact with each other in different ways, but very much groups of 3 or 4, very set in terms of group size, but often to the detriment of teacher flexibility or teachers being able to make decisions in the moment, best serve their students at any given time or any given day.
Why did they come up with the number 3 to 4?
Some say 3, some say 4. I think some say 4 and they look at 3 and think that someone's going to be left out. And they say 4, that some folks say, well, you can have a high student, a low student that's been identified in some arbitrary way, and trying to get away from ability groups, and that 4 seems to make sense to some researchers. Nothing really more profound that I've found other than that.
We talk about teachable moments in the classroom. How were you able to turn an unexpected student grouping situation into a researchable moment?
It really was serendipitous because it all came in a larger research study that had nothing to do with student groups or anything like that. It was just me doing my research of my students, and at the time, seeing this group of 3 and this group of 4 merge together and create this group of 7. And perhaps, being honest with myself, as a teacher, maybe if I wasn't a teacher researcher at that time, maybe I would have intervened and said something and asked questions and maybe had them break back into their group of 3 or 4. But having the role of a teacher researcher at that time, being more inquisitive and more open to the idea of, well, let's play this out and let's give them some space and some trust and see how it works without completely relinquishing my role as a teacher, still wanting there to be rigor and wanting the students to succeed, but providing them more space to do that. And so really it wasn't until later that I saw this call for this special issue about grouping students that I looked back and I thought, hey, I think I actually have some in my data that would fit. And so then I went back and I explored it a little bit more, and that's how this writing came about.
I was so surprised that you had so much detail about it and thinking it was serendipitous, and how were you able to make that a research project? But I understand now it's part of a bigger research project.
It really gathered my attention and curiosity at the time, but I was not thinking about student grouping, or it had really nothing to do with the main questions that I had, but it really did interest me as it went on. It was something that I was curious about day in and day out. How are they going to interact today? And how are they going to carry over from their work yesterday? And I really was rooting and interested along the side to see how this group of 7 would continue and morph and evolve as their work went on.
For this group of middle school students, what were the key elements that you found that attributed to their success, where past research suggested smaller groups?
I think for them, it was about having more say in their work. Students don't often have that, whether they're middle school students or elementary students. And I think my experience as a middle school teacher, it's especially important for students to be able to have a little bit more say of what they're doing and shaping, not necessarily to an extent what they learn, but then how they exhibit their learning and how they go about doing the work on a day-to-day basis and having choice. I had students who worked alone. I had students who worked in pairs, in groups of 3 and groups of 4, and this group was working in a group of 7. And so for them just being able to have that space and be able to make a choice, I tried to tell my students that they can't learn responsibility unless they've given the opportunity to be responsible. And so for them, I tried to give them that space to be responsible. And I think they really latched onto that. I think they felt, hey, all right, we've been entrusted to do this, and so let's make the most of it.
You don't mention the more traditional groups. Did their work differ in any way from this larger group?
I don't think so. I think for the most part, all of the students found ways to work in their own best interests. I would say, obviously, the work wasn't perfect, and it took a lot of negotiation for me with the students to make sure that the work was productive and it was relevant, it was rigorous. But for the most part, I think the students were working in their best interest. They chose students to work with that would help them, that they would be able to contribute and be in a contributing relationship, whether it was with one person or two or three or six other people. And for the one or two students that I had who worked alone, that was in their best interest at that time. And so that was the choice they made. And I think they were all motivated by doing something that would best fit their learning style and their learning needs, given the task at that moment.
In your discussion, you talk about a community of practice that developed, and how can this literature inform or challenge this traditional literature of grouping of students?
Well, I think what I tried to really think about and talk about or write about is that there's certain things, best practices have their place in the literature, but as teachers, we have to really keep our eye on the ball, and that's the students, and we can't let a list of best practices go unexamined as we teach. It's a great place to build our practice and what we do in the classroom, but if we are simply blindly following what we've read as these are the best practices, then we might lose sight of what's happening in front of us, because those people who wrote those best practices don't know our students. Mm-hmm. They don't know them right in front of us. And so we have to be able to have the ability to teach in the moment and to be able to say, well, this is how I'm going to adapt it to my class and to this time and space. And while the best practices are a great guide, can be, what's most important is my students and their learning. It's not an adherence to a best practice. It's an adherence to our students. And oftentimes, there's not a difference between the two. One complements the other. But sometimes best practices don't complement that learning process and what's in the best interest of your students and their learning. And so when that happens, A, we have to be able to understand that that's not happening. And B, we have to be able to provide an alternative that's going to meet the needs of our students rather than meeting the needs of some program or some research that's out there.
How has what you learned from this experience affect how you teach your own pre-service teachers?
I think I try to use this really as an opportunity for them to think about questioning their assumptions about what best practice is. For instance, I have an activity at the beginning of one of my classes where I have them draw a map of the ideal classroom. And we've been in class maybe about a month. So they have some sort of understanding of some things and draw a map and explain why you've drawn this classroom map the way that it is. And, well, most of them will put their kids in groups. And it was decades ago, you'd see them all in rows. And I think a lot of teachers wouldn't be able to say, well, why do you have them in rows? Well, I don't know, just because they will be unruly if they're not in rows. And now we ask teachers, well, why are they in groups? Well, because that's what you do. But we don't know why it is that we do that. And oftentimes we'll have kids in groups of 4 doing individual things. They won't be working socially with the kid sitting across from them. And if they dare speak to the kid sitting across from them, then they'll be in trouble, even though they're positioned to talk in groups. And so I think it's about questioning the assumptions that we have going into teaching and understanding that we as professionals aren't just here to follow a program blindly or follow what research says, but it's to be critical. And why is it that this is considered a best practice? And is that good or bad? And thinking more about the philosophy and the design of these things that we've come to incorporate as best practice.
Well, thank you so much. This article is an excellent example of the teacher-researcher model and how it applies to the field as well as to our instruction. So I really enjoyed reading it and hope others will too.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks. The full citation for today's article is Horn, 2012, Too Big to Fail, Rethinking Group Work in a Restructured Middle School. Voices from the Middle, Volume 20, Number 2, pages 35 to 39. This citation can also be found at the website education.illinoisstate.edu/faculty_staff/research/podcasts. Join us for future Research Break broadcasts.
This podcast is sponsored by Illinois State University's College of Education, where we strive to assure that all students realize the democratic ideal through our teaching, research, and service to the field of education.